Hello and welcome back to Rehydrate. This season we'll be reading and discussing Isaac Asimov's Foundation trilogy. This is season 6, episode 4, The General, covering part 1 of the second book of the trilogy, Foundation and Empire. The hosts have varying levels of knowledge on this book and this series, and my name is Dan, and I'm only read up to this point.
My name is Talia. I've also only read up to this point. However, as you may have noticed, our listening schedule was a bit wonky this week, so I ended up rereading The General, so I might have more knowledge on this than any of the Asimov so far.
My name is Priya, and I have only read the Foundation series up to this point so far. And for this book, I'm actually doing something a little different, and I'm listening to it on Audible instead of reading it. So it'll be interesting to see how the experience is a little different.
We're not sponsored, by the way.
Yeah, you could try to use the code Rehydrate, but it probably won't work. Talking a little bit about the schedule. So it has been a long while since we recorded last time. That's just, holiday scheduling and life scheduling got in the way. So we're back. We're staying on, this series. We're going to continue on it. As it stands right now, it's the holidays in the US. So schedules might get a little bit more mixed around. So apologize for not every 2 weeks, but we're trying our best around, 3 people's schedules with work and home life and all that kind of stuff. So please bear with us.
Dan's just reminding me, I spent the holiday season in Canada, and I ended up having to cross the US-Canada border, and I had to explain to the Border Patrol about, the duration of my visit and why I was there. And I was saying, yeah, I've only been here since Thanksgiving. And they squinted at me, and I realized, oh my gosh, for them, Thanksgiving, they were like, you've been here for a month and a half? I was like, no, I've been here for 2 days. Canadian Thanksgiving. Can't speak about Thanksgiving and Canada and expect it not to raise some eyebrows. So bear with us if we have international listeners. We're all based in America.
Okay. Well, I first wanted to give a little bit of history on this chapter. I put together, when I read it, I was really interested in this kind of feeling about this chapter. I really liked it. And, we'll talk more about that as we get into it. But I want to kind of research more about how it came to be. Originally, The General was first published in April of 1945 in an issue of Astounding Science Fiction under the title The Dead Hand. And we see that The Dead Hand, come up a lot. So it's interesting that it got renamed to The General later. And also this whole story is based off of real life events from back in Roman history. It's basically like a rehashing of the story of Belisarius and Justinian from basically the Byzantine era of the Roman Empire. And if you're interested in that, I put up an interview a couple weeks ago with my friend Jason, who's like a big time Roman history buff. And he gave a lot of cool backstory and back history of the actual history between Justinian and Belisarius. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and I would recommend you go ahead and listen to that.
He also hasn't listened to Foundation, so it's automatically spoiler free if that's something you're avoiding.
Yeah. Although I think they had a couple spoilers in there, but it was only up to this point of the show anyway, so spoiler free up to this point. All right, well, let's jump into the summary for this episode. So we start out with Belrios, a general in the Imperial Army, who meets Dukum Bar, son of Omen Bar, on Suiana. Rios is looking for more information on the quote-unquote magicians, of which Bar has studied for decades since Hober Mallow visited his father, and tells Rios that there are no magicians, only Harry Seldon's psychohistory, which predicts the fall of the Empire. After returning from the Foundation, Rios tells Bar and intends to challenge the dead hand of psychohistory by starting a war to conquer the Foundation. On Trantor, Brodrig meets with Emperor Cleon, who are both concerned with Rios' request for reinforcements in his conquest. Cleon sends Brodrig to observe. The war against the Foundation has started, and Rios has already made great strides using the strategy of an enclosing sphere, but Bar is still convinced of the inevitability of the fall of the Empire as predicted by Seldon. After the start of Rios' war, he captures a Foundation traitor named Lathan Devers, who he holds captive along with Bar for information about the Foundation. Devers insists that psychohistory is just a story that no one really believes. Brodrig arrives on Suiana and questions Bar and Devers. Beforehand, Devers has devised a plan to bribe Brodrig and pit him against Rios. However, it's ultimately Devers who's bribed with 100,000 credits for information about why Rios might want to conquer the Foundation. Devers tells him it's because Rios wants to capture the secrets of transmutation. Later, Rios becomes impatient with Bar endeavors, thinking that they're withholding information from him, but Bar catches him unaware and hits him with a bust of Cleon II, and they make their escape to Devers' ship. During the escape, Bar takes a message intended for Rios, which includes the line, "The ultimate ends in view will surely be gained." They believe that if they can give this message to the Emperor, then it can be proof that Rios and Brodrig are planning to overthrow him, so they make plans to go to Trantor. Their plan is ultimately unsuccessful, as they try to bribe contacts who will get them an audience with Cleon, but run into an undercover agent, which they are forced to kill and to escape Trantor with only their lives. They're able to escape, but when they think that their plan has failed, they read the news that Rios and Brodrig have been recalled and arrested. Back at the Foundation, they realize it was the natural forces that were predicted by psychohistory rather than their actions. The Empire's ability for conquest has been eliminated since weak generals are ineffectual and strong generals will be suspected by emperors. And so, once again, the dead hand of Harry Seldon allows the inevitability of the fall of the Empire. The only remaining threat is the possibility of the Second Foundation.
So the characters in this section, the general, are as follows. Belrios, the last of the Imperials, a general in the Imperial Army. Ducum Bar, son of Onum Bar. Senet Forel, leader of the merchant princes, possibly Hober Mallow's illegitimate son. Cleon II, the Emperor of the Galactic Empire. Amwell Brodrig, a secretary to Cleon II. Latham Devers, a Foundation traitor, captured by Belrios. And Sergeant Maury Luke, serves under Rios, guards Bar and Devers.
Okay, well, maybe we should start with general thoughts around this. The kind of change, I see this as a kind of a big change between the first book, just the kind of bigger narrative that's like more consistent. And it also pulls in a lot of characters that we heard about before. You know, we have like connections to Mallow, we have, the connections to Bar, a lot of, kind of like through lines between the last book and this one, where the last book seemed to be a lot more segmented, like there are kind of individual chapters that didn't really have anything to do with each other than the kind of overarching theme of Harry Seldon and psychohistory, right? But I saw this one as a lot more consistent and just better storytelling, I thought. So what did you guys think?
It's definitely aided by having a shorter time period. Like we can have people who are the sons of people we know, like one generation. We don't have these somewhat awkward, like 100-year skips. And I did agree that it felt more lively and easier to follow. And not just because I felt like we had time to settle into a story and actually predict and anticipate some of the beats. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but I was like, we spoke about bribery on this planet. We'll probably see that in action. We get a little taste of bureaucracy. We see how that intersects with crime, and it all is coherent and a little bit contained. So I found it lively, and I have some more thoughts we can get into. Yeah, tell us what you thought, Priya, since I know you were the contrarian last time we wrapped up our Foundation impressions.
I may at times still be a contrarian, but I do agree that this part read a lot more easily because you have a list of characters that's kind of spanning the course of what reads kind of like almost like a standalone story, like a short story, like an installment, which is kind of how it was written. So, and the plot feels a lot more linear in this case. So that made it a little easier for me to consume.
I think it's also interesting how the kind of expectations are subverted, like you kind of get the sense as the story is going along that, they are going to be with the Emperor, and the Emperor, they're gonna trick him into, or at least convince him that Rios is like actually a bad guy, but actually they don't do anything. Then it ends up just like, Harry Seldon was right the whole time. Like it's just going to happen naturally, and they don't really need to do anything. And that's sort of the overall theme of these books so far is that like inaction is like the way to go, right? You just kind of like sit back and watch it happen. You don't need to do anything. It's just the Empire's going to fall on its own.
Yeah, it gives the sense that like anything you do is really just a waste of energy on your part. And that's kind of like a depressing thought to me, that like because it seems like a lot of energy is being expended by these characters, but then in the end it's like, you need not have done any of that.
Yeah, I mean, like they knocked Rios on the head. They like killed the Sergeant Luck there, who's kind of sad. That guy was kind of pretty funny. They killed the other agent. They escaped. They had this whole thing to escape from the empire, and it was like, well, we didn't really need to do all that stuff. What happened anyway?
I was waiting in the wings to bring up my impression on this, and I couldn't imagine segue, but here comes the Chinese history aspect. This whole section just reminded me a lot of classical Taoism or Taoism, depending on how you pronounce it, and their whole guiding philosophy of Wu Wei, which is without effort. And it's this whole philosophy of it's not laziness, but everything is done without effort. And even if you're carving a pig and if you're slashing it, you're doing it completely wrong. But if you're just carving it so perfectly, there's nothing for the knife to even push. It just slides through. And that's a metaphor for just that's the way it was always supposed to be. And that's the way that you can achieve these ends, but not take action. It's more dense than that, but I was just sort of nodding along definitely this makes sense.
Yeah, and there's just a lot of quotes that I kind of picked up around just kind of the lack of free will and just the inevitability of psychohistory.
It does conjure up those problems. Anytime you have a situation where action and inaction yield the same results, that's sort of troubling for human will and free will and our considerations of ourselves.
Yeah, for sure. Because we want to feel like we're in control of situations, right? And the only way for us to control the situations is by taking action. Mm-hmm. But it feels really uncomfortable if you know something's going to happen. And maybe that's why people are so skeptical of psychohistory in the first place, because it's hard for us to accept as humans that we can't have any influence on future events, right? Where things are just predetermined, right? The history or the future is predetermined. And there's nothing you can do. You're just kind of on that path.
I think it's just called predeterminism.
I think that's really uncomfortable for humans. And that's, maybe why Seldom was seen in the beginning as a raven, right? He's oh, this guy is saying can't really do anything to impact the fall of something like the empire, right? We all love the empire. So what can we do to save it? Well, nothing. It's gonna fall. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So some of the quotes that I picked up, I thought were interesting. Was the first one is because of the dead hand of mathematics of human behavior that can neither be stopped, swerved, nor delayed. The two faced each other in deadlock until the general had stepped back. He said simply, "I'll take that challenge. It's a dead hand against a living will." So Rios is fighting against the idea that he can't do anything, right? He's saying I can impact history, but we can see that he can't, because Selden, way back when he did these predictions, knew the difference between having a strong general and a weak general versus a strong emperor and a weak emperor. They can't get to a point where they can exist from one or the other, because we can see that the emperor got suspicious of Rios on his own, because he had seen this line of emperors before him get killed or otherwise dethroned, and he's going to kind of react against that, right? And talking to Jason about the Roman history, that seems to be a real theme in Roman history as well. He'd have all these people who are going after the Roman emperorship, right? So yeah, this is kind of mirroring that. And so Rios is trying to fight against it, but it's not going to be successful.
I didn't have this association when I was reading, but to hear you describe the weak and the strong generals having the same outcome, did it remind you at all about the chains of suspicion in the Dark Forest? In that it doesn't matter really if they're malevolent or benevolent.
That's true.
It just comes to the same. Yeah.
Yeah. You won't know. The whole part of the chains of suspicion is that even if they say they're benevolent, you don't know that they're,
or even if they are.
Right?
No, right. It's worse than if they're lying. It's if they're perfectly honest, if they actually are benevolent, you just can't know. You'll never be able to know.
Right.
Even if they truly are.
Right. And who knows if they will be eventually, right? Might be a problem. Humans right now are maybe benevolent in the world of
mostly harmless.
Right. But because of our exponential growth in technology, right? In whatever many years, we're going to be a problem. So yeah.
It just reminded me of comes back to inevitability again.
Yeah. I think inevitability is a big theme of Remembrance of Earth Past as well. So yeah, it's a good point. Priya, I saw you. I just saw the chat that you dropped off.
No, I'm back.
Okay.
Yeah, I was listening the whole time. So this also kind of reminds me of this short story that I sometimes bring up, which is called The Cold Equations.
Oh, yeah.
And that is also, there is a sort of like inevitability, because when you're out in space and when you're talking about like the grand scheme of things, like personal intentions and actions don't really matter. What matters in the end is like the inevitability of how the math is going to sort of just work against you. Without giving any spoilers about the story itself, it's a very sad and depressing story, as evidenced by the title. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that too. So like, I would recommend giving that a read. It's not very long.
Yeah, that's a good good analogy
Dan has
there.
read it.
Yeah, I read it because you had mentioned it before, and yeah, it's really it's. I mean, I think we can say it's it's a story that's just as old as Foundation, so we can put spoiler tags in here if you don't want to read it. If you're not going to read it, or you don't want to hear spoilers for it, you can jump ahead to the next section. But yeah, it's just a really depressing story, and it all has to do with math, right? Like, and just like the realities of space travel, and like how much energy you have, and like if you don't conserve enough energy, then you won't be able to land on the planet, right? You'll just like skip past it, then you'll also die. So, he ends up having to kill like this little girl just because like there's nothing you can do. Like, this is like, you're either going to kill this girl or you're going to like not get the vaccine to the whole planet of people. And so it sort of leads itself into psychohistory too. Psychohistory is all based off mathematics and like trying to not mitigate the, 10,000 years of chaos for just 1,000 years.
That's right.
Yeah.
They have their own little trolley problem built in.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's one thing you might not know if you're a listener. But one of the great things about Dan is like, if you recommend something to him, he usually like does the thing. He usually listens to it or reads it or does some research on it. So it doesn't surprise me that you picked up The Cold Equations. When you first brought it up, Priya, I was just thinking about that, like the opening lines in a Bill Bryson book. I can't remember quite which one, but it states like, the best thing to know about space is that it's aptly named. There's just like so much of it. Like, you can't really have these space fantasy stories because they all take place in such a small, survivable amount of it. And if you actually do the math, it's inevitable. It's crushing.
Yeah, and it also reminds me of this quote from the Remembrance of Earth's Past series, where I don't remember which character says it, but it's one of the characters who's on. I think it might have been Guan Yifan, or one of the characters on this the ships, that says it takes like 5 minutes of being out in the vast expanse of space for people to start losing their humanity. And I keep thinking about how in Foundation we are so far removed from that tether to the earth where humanity originated, that like you're no longer dealing with and talking about the same humans. I know that they are characterized the same way as we know humans to be, but there is something fundamentally different and changed about them, because they're not the humans that we know of, that like the origin story of humans is on Earth, and now these humans in these stories are so many, like thousands, millions of years past that. So it's interesting to keep that in mind too.
Yeah, definitely.
I want to do a little bit of a turn in the other direction for this section of Foundation, because I thought it did actually have some humor. It wasn't all just like bleak and dark. And one of the ways I saw that was actually in characterization. I know, like in an Asimov novel. Who knew? I found it in Emperor Cleon, or Cleon II. I found him an interesting and amusing character to watch. He's presented as like sickly, and he sees that as just so much more of a nuisance than like, an agony. He's very dismissive. He's got all these busybody doctors who are hurrying around him and trying to cure him with these new methods and with these ancient texts. And he even remarks like, if these secrets in the ancient texts were real, like the ancients themselves could just give it to me because it would have saved them. And it won't. So it won't save me. mortality wins again. And I thought, like, there's just humor in that. There's humor in them going to this planet and having to like sign things in triplicate and bribe people to get through. It's like, navigating through Egypt. Like, it's very practical and comedic in that way. And I think that's what kept me clipping through this in a way that I hadn't read the first book.
Yeah, I think like the relationship between Bar and Endeavors, I thought was also really good. Like the kind of like the buddy adventure. Buddy adventure between, because like they have like their little secret meeting and like when they're in their captivity, like they kind of devise their plan, and then like after a while,
right.
like, yeah.
But they also talk about like, hey, this plan is not so good. Like there's a little self-awareness, and then there's like, these things that we capture are so janky. If this came from the Foundation, it could be so much better. So there's, I feel like with the right actors and the right casting, that could just be stretched out even more.
Yeah, and then they get the message, and the message is like useless. It seems like when they first get it, like, oh, we did all that stuff for this stupid message.
I know, just like life.
Right. And then they realize, like, well, maybe we could just this little part, and then like, and then they realize that they all was useless anyway. I'm like, well, all right, I guess
a lot of effort, not worth it. Moral of the story.
I'd like to be a Debbie Downer in this moment and just state the obvious that we were talking about in the last episode, probably, which is that yet again we have no female characters.
Yeah. I'm guessing that's going to be a thing in the whole series.
Yeah, like speaking of the buddy relationship. Yeah, all dudes again.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's. I remember reading somewhere that there is some like stronger female character. I don't know. I think I saw some posts on Reddit or something, but complaining about the same thing, and rightfully so. Like there's
rightfully so
representation. Yeah,
but at the same time, like these could easily be a woman and a man or two women, and I think the story would still work. And sometimes it's very clumsy to just gender swap. I know on the Remembrance of Earth's Past podcast, you're like, Chung Sheen could be a woman or she could be a man. And I was like, I don't know. I feel like we'd have to do some rewrites in that way. But in Dune, I mean, very, very mild Dune spoiler ahead. The planetologist Liette Kynes becomes a woman, and that's fine. It still serves the story, and I think the same sort of casting could save this slightly dated show. Show.
And that's why I really appreciated the characters that were changed to female in the show, because it's not necessary for plot propulsion for them to be male or female. It is a bit jarring when you're reading a book and every single character is only a male character. So I don't know. I appreciated it, and like it made the show feel less jarring, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think many of these characters, I don't think any of these characters really could not be gender swapped, right? Like, I can't think of any of them that we've met so far that it would.
I kind of like the Emperor being male, just because he's so like preening and effete.
Yeah,
I think it's funnier.
Yeah, I agree. Cleon needs to be a male.
Yeah. All right,
but like for the most part, like I can't really think of. I mean, even if Selden was female, or I mean, obviously Jared Harris is worth him not doing gender swaps, but I think any of the characters, I think Cleon aside, maybe that it could be. It wouldn't matter to me, right? There's nothing particularly male about any of them that they have to be super masculine. Maybe like the Luck couldn't be a female. Maybe it could be. It could have like what's that girl from Star Wars? The
Rey.
Brienne. I remember Brienne from Game of Thrones, and the girl who's also in Star. What was her name? Gwen.
This is so your wheelhouse, Dan. I'm not going to help you out.
I forgot her name. I know the characters' names. I don't know the actors'
names. Live
name.
Theater, folks.
Anyway,
wait, is it Gwendolyn? Gwendolyn? Is that her name?
Is it Gwendolyn Christie?
Yeah,
maybe.
Yeah, that's her.
Something like that. Anyway, Brienne from Game of Thrones. I can see her as being Sergeant Luck there. Another topic what I want to talk about is like kind of another theme of this is like sort of like the loss of knowledge that kind of happens throughout the history here, right? And so another thing is like kind of on display here, and like even in this past, like it was like 100 years or not even 100 years since Mallow, right? Like the emperor already forgot about the foundation, which I thought was really interesting. So the quote I pulled out said, the previous secretary raised a pair of supercilious eyebrows. He refers to them as the foundation. The foundation? What is it? There's no record of it, sire. So like, it's only been like 100 or 200 years or whatever since the foundation was started. And the emperor, people that came before him, set it up, and like it's already forgotten. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the first book, right? Where we were kind of marveling at how they seem to have forgotten the history of like where humanity originated. And all of that, that history seems to have been lost. And of course, it kind of evokes that famous quote that those who don't remember history are doomed to repeat it. It's kind of very troubling that they forget their own history. And this seems like it's happening not even that long after Foundation is formed. So for the emperor to not know about Foundation is kind of ridiculous. And also, in that same vein, I found it really interesting how psychohistory and Harry Seldon, they're kind of reduced to fables and like thrillers that you tell children. So
they're called magicians, right?
Yeah. So it's just like the language. I mean, the running theme is that language has returned to a state of like antiquity, and also like the view of history seems to be following that same route in a sense.
Yeah, I wonder if it's like something to do with the actual people, or maybe just the massive scale of the empire and the bureaucracy behind it, like where things like the foundation could just get lost to history over just a couple hundred years. But yeah, like there's
really
like that
realistic. Like people are so often saying like, oh my gosh, like 2020 is the most memorable year ever. Like no one's gonna ever forget it. Our grandkids are gonna be asking us like, did we ever ask any of our grandparents about, hey, what was it like to live through polio? Like that must have been life-changing for the whole world. No, like it's so easy to forget. It's so easy to focus on myopic things that relate to you. I think it's very realistic.
Yeah, especially like if people don't believe in psychohistory, or they don't want to believe it because of the lack of free will. Like maybe it's just it turns into the story that people tell you. Oh, there's this crazy guy a couple hundred years ago. He said the whole empire is going to fall. Isn't that ridiculous? Yeah, just in general, like we're seeing, like I mentioned before, the kind of path to victory, or not the path of victory, just like the path to the inevitability is just inaction, right? We saw that with Mallow, and we saw that with Hardin, and so we see it here too. But you guys had some more quotes, so I'll let you talk more about it.
Yeah. So one of the quotes that I found interesting was where it says, Cleon is strong because he permits no strong subjects. It seems that in his case, this also foreshadows the empire's fall, because like if you're kind of like an unbending type of person and you permit no one beneath you to be strong, like in this case, the example is that the general, he's technically a subject, is strong, and thus he is reined in by Cleon himself, which ultimately leads Foundation to win. And it's not a victory for Empire. It may be like a personal sense of victory for Cleon, but that's false. So I think that statement is sort of like not exactly true. It's kind of like the sort of statement that makes you want to question it. Is he really strong because he permits no strong subjects? So I think that also speaks to how the problem that we were seeing with the general, which is that like if he wasn't strong, he would be unsuccessful. And even if he is strong, he will be unsuccessful. So yeah, that was just an interesting quote that stood out to me. And then the other thing that stood out to me is I was reading a review on this story. And while I do agree that this one was far more compelling than the other ones that we had been reading so far, I found that the reviewer, and I forgot to link it, but I'll share the link with Dan so he can share it. is that I'll paraphrase. Asimov has written himself into an unfortunate corner. It destroys any real conflict in future stories. The Foundation cannot lose no matter what. In earlier stories, we'd been shown that the Foundation would win if it had leaders like Hardin and Mallow who knew the right thing to do. Now we see that the Foundation will win even if its leaders don't know the right thing to do. And that leaves for little source of tension in later stories. And I kind of agree with that point. I don't know. What do you guys think?
So I'll say, with no foreknowledge of what happens in the books, but what happened the last like paragraph or so of this section talks about the second Foundation. So we don't know that the Foundation is going to win. All we know is that the Empire is going to fall, right? And soon, and the chaotic era or whatever they call it is going to last for 1,000 years if the Foundation can do anything about it, right? It seems like the Foundation is going to. It is in a position for power, but like we don't know which Foundation. There's a second Foundation on the other side of the galaxy, so like maybe this main source of conflict is going to be between those two Foundations. Because like it would be anticlimactic to kind of know the ending and just kind of like just watch it happen, like if the whole 7 books of this series was just like them just sitting around doing nothing and seeing history kind of unfold around them, that wouldn't be super interesting, right? But it seems like the conflict that's being set up is between possibly the two Foundations.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, we don't know anything about the second Foundation either, right? Like we know like the one that we've been following is like more scientific. In the first book we saw them as like kind of even ineffectual because like they're just so stuck up on trying to interpret it, making the encyclopedia, interpreting Stelden's messages, that kind of thing. Maybe the second Foundation is like totally militaristic and totally different. Who knows? Like it could be like totally different philosophically than the Foundation we know of.
Yeah, so it'll be interesting if our predictions, Dan and my predictions, since we don't know anything more about the Foundation, turn out to mirror more of the Roman Empire, since it's clearly a bit of an allegory for the fall of a big empire. And you're right, Dan, it's a lot easier to predict that something cumbersome and large with many vulnerabilities will fall than it is to predict what will take its place. And I know that when the Roman Empire did fall, they had something crazy like 5 monarchs in like 2 years and like 2 popes and just like a crazy power struggle.
Yeah.
And I think that I'm hoping that is what happens, but I'm not sure if it'll be between the two Foundations or if we'll have rebel groups or, maybe just more forces for chaos. But I think there's reason to have a little bit of faith for the rest of the books.
That's interesting because I think, who says this? Was it Devers or Barr where they're talking about like if there's a war and there's a winner, what if the winner does take over? Who's bothered? It settles itself out. Someone says that in this section, and it's kind of like,
again, very funny. It does settle itself out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't remember who says that, but yeah,
I think it was in a conversation with Devers and Barr. One of them said it, but I can't remember.
So the last point I had was just kind of talking more about kind of following up on this about the Empire's inability to succeed. And like we mentioned before, I think Priya, one of your original quotes was talking about like weak emperors and strong emperors. So the quote's kind of long, but I thought it was like a really interesting experience, like the analysis of like why the Empire is kind of doomed to fail and why it has no ability for conquest. So it says, we can see now that the social background of the Empire makes wars of conquest impossible for it. Under weak emperors, it's torn apart by generals competing for a worthless and surely death-bringing throne. Under strong emperors, the empire is frozen into a paralytic rigor in which disintegration apparently ceases for the moment, but only at the sacrifice of all possible growth. The dead hand of Harry Seldon, he knew that a man like Rios would have to fall, since it was a success that brought failure, and the greater the success, the surer the failure. That part, like I thought was, and I think if I remember right, the Rios and the Broderick get executed. I think that was alluded to, which doesn't actually happen in history. Like Belisarius wasn't actually executed, but there are stories about him that are maybe apocryphal. That he got his eyes plucked out and he had to like live his life as a beggar. But I don't think that actually happened. But yeah, the point here is that like because like these forces are against each other and they can't because strong emperors can't abide by strong generals and the other and the opposite. There's no way the empire is going to be able to succeed long term. I don't know that the foundation fixes that unless they completely change the paradigm of how territory is gained and controlled and that kind of thing. So that'd be interesting to see. Like maybe that's how the story goes, that the empire does fall, the foundation does take over, and then it's like, well, how do you rule it so you don't fall? Or did they just fall into the same trap? And then they Zeldin's prediction says, oh, actually, like the foundation is also going to fall in this many years.
I think the way that the emperors have also been shown so far in the series is like it just kind of reminds me of like kingdoms in like Game of Thrones, where like it seems like everyone is kind of doomed to failure.
Yeah.
And you see like their fatal flaws are very apparent and on the nose. They're just kind of painted as like very stereotypical. What you would expect of an emperor of an empire is what you get, right?
Yeah.
So it seems like these characters are sort of like more symbolic than anything, and they're less characters and more symbols of this overarching idea that like these types of individuals are doomed to failure. That's what the cynic in me sees anyway.
I can see what you're saying. Yeah, I understand that point of view.
I was even looking, wasn't there was a quote somewhere saying how, yeah, here it is. Cleon II, commonly called the Great, the last strong emperor of the First Empire. He is important for political and artistic renaissance that took place during his long reign. He is best known to romance, however, for his connection with Belrios, and to the common man, he is simply Rios' emperor. It is important not to allow the events of the last year of his reign to overshadow the 40 years of ... And that's from the Encyclopedia Galactica that the Foundation was making. So it sounds like, even before this, like he had 40 years of kind of prosperity and like he was like regarded as like a strong emperor. But he's also sort of seeing, and I think very similarly, like,
wait, hang on. He didn't have 40 years of prosperity due to his own rule. He like inherited peace and never knew anything but it.
True.
Like daddy did all the work and granddaddy before him.
Yeah.
Like the third Qing emperor. I could go on. It's another podcast.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, because like when we meet him, he's like, yeah, all sickly and we can see like even after this, like he's like kind of jealous of Rios and suspicious of everybody, maybe rightfully so.
Yeah, definitely. If he goes down in history as Rios' emperor.
Yeah,
rightfully so.
But it's interesting to hear that they call him the Great, and it says specifically like he was the last strong emperor of the First Empire. So it seems like stuff's going to go pretty bad pretty soon here, and this is like the last year of his reign, right? And so if this is the last year of the last emperor, like stuff's about to happen. That's maybe the fall of the empire isn't as long and protracted as we expected, but it's going to be more swift, and there'd be some catalyst to make that happen. I also wanted to talk a little about the TV show. So if you don't care about the TV show or don't want to have any spoilers for it, you can stop listening to the episode here, like last time. So thanks for listening. But we're going to talk about the TV show. I have still not watched any of it. I've read a bunch of stuff about it. Not a bunch of stuff, but I've seen a bunch of posts on Reddit about how people hate it. But I know, Priya, you said you liked it. So
I do.
I kind of want to get an update from you about like, and I don't know if it's over yet for this season, or I don't know if it's still happening. Okay.
No, the season finale was, I think, a couple of weeks ago, and I liked it. I thought at times it was less than perfect. I mean, the show is not perfect by any means, but like there were episodes that weren't as good as others, and there are storylines that are not as good as others. There's one particular storyline that keeps me gripped throughout, and I can't say what it is because it's a spoiler. Yeah, I think that the strong plot points are enough to keep you engaged in the show, I feel. But of course, I feel like my opinion on that is going to differ because my opinion on the books kind of differs from those who are huge fans of the books. There's always going to be some of that where, like, if you're, and it's because the show is very different from the books. So if you're expecting to go into the show and have a similar experience to the book, which is like a lot of it is characters just talking back and forth to each other about like strategy and politics, that's not really what the show is. So it's a very different experience. And if you liked these particular elements of the book, just know that you're not going to necessarily get them in the show. The show does a lot more world building, and it's a lot more, it creates like a thrill in the viewer about certain plot points. There's a lot more action. Like if that's your thing, then you'll probably really enjoy the show. I was looking at Talia's comment, which you can share, because that brings me to my next point. What were you going to say about it, Talia?
Yeah, definitely. So I was wondering if you had similar thoughts about Dune, and Dune was called unfilmable, and it's been like stalled in production hell for decades, partially because it's difficult to translate certain books to the screen. So that's another, how would you say it compares?
So I'm glad you bring up Dune, because I recently watched it, and my brother-in-law, I was recommending that he watch it, but the day that he went on HBO to watch it, it was like one day before they had taken it off. So just bad luck, because he's visiting from Australia, and in Australia it hasn't been released yet in theaters. It's about to be like on December, I think today actually. But anyway, he was trying to watch it on HBO, it wasn't there, and then so he started reading the book. And that should not be your progression to a book. I think that the fact that the movie wasn't available, but he had a long flight back to Australia, and he started listening to it on audiobook, and he said that
I think that's exactly the right way to be introduced to Dune. You got a solid like 12 hours ahead of you.
Yeah, that part is conducive. But I was like, he was texting me from his flight, and he was like, I'm struggling with this. And I was like, I've heard a lot of people do struggle with it, so just start listening to Three Body Problem instead. Hey. But
there's a podcast you can follow along with if wants to get more context.
Yeah. I was thinking about that a lot of people say that, and he had the same experience. I have not tried reading the book yet, but I have been reading Foundation. I find that Foundation at times loses me and causes me to tune out, and the show doesn't. So I think that the only way to translate certain things to film is to take a lot of artistic license. And I feel like a lot of times book readers do not like a lot of artistic license being taken. But I think it depends on the nature of the content that you're working with. Like conversations and dialogue that make up Foundation rarely makes for very compelling show viewing experience if that is all that there is to the show, or most of the show. So I think that they have added in a lot of like theatrical elements and storylines and character plot points that I haven't seen in the book so far. And I think that is what makes it work. And I think also what they're doing seems to make sense here, because now that I've started reading the second book, I'm noticing certain elements cropping up that are in the show. So, and I can't say what those are, but it seems to me that they've borrowed bits and pieces from the different Foundation books and kind of melded them together in the show. And as I read more of the books, it'll be interesting to see what they took and what they changed and where they took artistic license, I guess.
That's interesting, because I always like heard in the beginning like, oh, they're just doing the first book or the first couple chapters or whatever of the book. So now you saying that makes me want to watch it even less until I'm finished reading the books, because I don't want to get accidentally spoiled by something.
But it's interesting because, like, is it a spoiler if you don't know that it's a spoiler?
True.
Because I feel like they have done a lot with characters that we've seen in previous books, that like characters that the books kind of like got rid of already.
Yeah.
And I feel like that can't be coming from other books. So I don't know. I feel like whenever if I'm seeing spoilers, I don't know if there's spoilers for the books or not. So I don't feel spoiled in the end. I don't know if that makes
I have
sense.
an example of that happening in the other direction, Priya, which comes to mind. And the hosts have all seen Dune by now, right?
I haven't seen it. I was gonna try to read the book before I watched it.
Oh, you do? Okay. Well, you should read the book before. I think it's much better. But I also like the movie just fine. I also just think that the movie is enhanced a lot by the book in a way that often, having read the book, frustrates the reader and, makes them see, like when I try and watch Harry Potter, it's like very painful. I'm like, this is not worth 10 minutes of my time, much less the 10 hours it would take to watch the show.
Stop.
But in Dune, I'm going to...
Contrarian the other way there.
Exactly. But in Dune, I really enjoyed watching the movie, and I was like, oh, this is cinematic. It's beautiful. It's well cast. It's well executed. But it would be so flat without the book. Like, there's so much characterization and explication and context that you can do, and you can meander through 700 pages. Like, I'm sorry, but there's just space to do it. And if you see it on screen, it feels like I'm getting a return on the investment of having read it, because I understand the import of these beats, of these characters, of their actions. Whereas if I didn't, it would just be like, oh, I guess plot A is over, on to plot B.
Yeah.
So I would definitely recommend reading it first.
Yeah, I had the same experience with the Game of Thrones series.
Hey, you've got a flight coming up.
Yeah. When I first watched I watched the first season of Game of Thrones, and I didn't really understand. I mean, I kind of understood what's happening, but there's so many characters, and you don't really understand their motivations. And so after the first season, I went back and read the entire series before the second season, and it was so much better having done that, because you really understand who the characters are, what their history is, what their motivations are. So that's why. Yeah, if there's something I feel like I'm going to read, and I do intend, I already have Dune ready to go. It's just a matter of time and slotting it into my list here. But that's why I'm not going to watch the movie for Dune. I'm not going to watch the Foundation one, because I really like Foundation. I think people like you spoke really highly of Dune, so I really want to read the book first so I can have that same experience.
Cool. Well, we can keep you accountable since you've said it on the podcast now. We can check with you throughout the rest of the season.
I just said I will. I don't say when I will.
But speaking of the season, thank you so much for listening. Check out rehydrate.space for released episodes, our reading list, and pronunciation guide. Leave comments by emailing us at rehydrate@fastmail.com or on Twitter at rehydratepod. Please join us next episode for Season 6, Episode 5, The Mule, covering Part 2, Chapters 11 through 18 of Foundation and Empire by Isaac Asimov.